There are weather stations in northern Chile that have sat on their tripods for decades without recording a single drop of rain. Not a trace, not even a mist reading. In some corners of this land, no rainfall has ever been measured since records began. And yet, if you crouch down at dawn and touch the stones, they are wet. The water does not fall from the sky here. It walks in off the ocean, low and silent, a fog the locals call the Camanchaca, and it settles on rock, on cactus spine, on a fine mesh net strung between two poles, and it becomes, drop by drop, enough. By day, this same ground looks almost lunar, cracked salt crusts, rust-colored volcanic rock, entire valleys where nothing green grows for as far as the eye can carry. NASA has tested Mars rovers on this exact terrain because it is, in certain patches, close to the most lifeless surface anywhere on this planet. And yet at night, the same sky that seems to have withheld everything opens into one of the clearest views of the universe that exists anywhere on Earth, thick with stars, the Milky Way spilling from horizon to horizon. This is the Atacama Desert, the driest place on Earth where people actually live, and this is Chile, a country so narrow you could stand in its center and see mountains and ocean in the same afternoon, so long that its northern tip bakes in permanent drought, while its southern tip calves ice into the sea. It is a place that has made a kind of art out of surviving on almost nothing, and somehow, out of that scarcity, built one of the most stable and quietly prosperous nations in South America. If that sounds like a contradiction, stay with me, because by the end of this film, you may understand exactly how it works. And if you're watching this from somewhere far from any desert, somewhere green and rainy and taking water completely for granted, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I read every one of them. If stories like this pull you in, this is exactly the kind of place this channel exists to explore. So consider subscribing before we go further, because northern Chile is only the beginning of what's coming. To understand how anyone lives here, you first have to understand what here even means, because Chile refuses to be one place. Pull up a map and you'll see a ribbon of land pressed flat against the western edge of South America, roughly 4,300 kilometers from top to bottom, and on average barely more than 170 kilometers wide. Squeezed between the Andes on one side and the Pacific on the other, Chile is, by most measures, the longest and narrowest country on the planet. If you rotated it and laid it across North America, it would stretch from the Canadian border almost to the Gulf of Mexico. That single geographic fact explains almost everything else about the country, because a nation this elongated cannot have one climate, one landscape, or one way of life. It has, by some counts, close to a dozen distinct climate zones packed into one long spine of land. At the top is the Atacama, a high, cold desert wedged between the Andes and the coastal range, and it earns the title of driest place on Earth for a very specific reason. The cold Humboldt Current sweeps up from the south, chilling the air above the Pacific, which creates a stubborn temperature inversion. Warm, moisture-laden air gets trapped high above a layer of cold, dry air sitting right at the surface, and the surrounding mountains block whatever rain clouds might otherwise drift in from the Amazon basin. The result is a desert caught in a double rain shadow, starved of moisture from every direction at once. Scientists have found this hyper-arid core has been essentially rainless for a staggeringly long time, long thought to be around 3 million years, though newer research has pushed some estimates back to nearly 45 million, which would make it not just the driest desert on the planet, but very possibly the oldest. What surprises most people is that it is not particularly hot. Because of that same cold ocean air pressing in, Atacama summers hover around the high teens Celsius, and desert nights can drop close to freezing. NASA has used sections of this terrain to test Mars rovers because the soil chemistry and the sheer lifelessness of certain patches genuinely resemble another planet. The town of Calama, on the desert's edge, reportedly went roughly 400 years without measurable rainfall until a freak storm broke the streak in 1972. A local story so specific it tells you everything about how rare water is here. Further north, near San Pedro de Atacama, the land opens into the vast white expanse of the Salar de Atacama, a salt flat sitting beneath the volcanic cone of Licancabur. And underneath that flat sits one of the largest lithium reserves on the planet, a mineral now feeding the world's batteries and electric cars. Copper, too, runs through this ground in extraordinary quantities. Chile has been the world's largest copper producer for decades, responsible for something close to a quarter of global supply. Most of it dug from enormous open-pit mines near the town of Calama. The Andes themselves reach their most dramatic heights in this northern stretch, too. Ojos del Salado, straddling the border with Argentina, rises to nearly 7,000 meters, making it the second highest peak anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, and a string of active volcanoes marches down the spine of the desert alongside it. Scattered across this same terrain are the ghosts of an earlier economic boom. Towns like Humberstone, once thriving centers of the nitrate mining industry that powered Chile's economy through the late 1800s and early 1900s, now stand abandoned. Their wooden theaters and worker housing preserved almost exactly as they were left when the market for natural nitrate collapsed. Humberstone is recognized today as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a monument to how quickly a boomtown here can become a ghost town once the mineral runs out or the world simply stops wanting it. Nearby, the enormous open-pit mine at Chuquicamata, close to Calama, has been described as one of the largest excavated pits on the planet, a scar in the earth so large it is visible from space, and it still anchors much of the regional economy today. Even Chile's reach into the Pacific carries its own strange stories. The Juan Fernandez Islands, hundreds of kilometers off the coast near Valparaiso, are where a marooned sailor named Alexander Selkirk once survived alone for years, inspiring the novel Robinson Crusoe, while Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, sits so far out in the ocean that it belongs to a different world entirely. Polynesian in culture and thousands of kilometers from the mainland, yet still unmistakably part of this same improbable country. Then the country simply keeps going south, and everything changes. The desert gives way to the fertile Mediterranean-style valleys around Santiago, where vineyards climb the foothills of the Andes and the seasons finally start to behave the way most of the world expects them to. Further south still, the land turns green and wet. Temperate rainforest and volcanic lakes give way to fjords, and eventually to the wind-scoured plains of Patagonia, where glaciers calve into channels only a few hundred kilometers from Antarctica. Around the city of Puerto Montt, the country slides into what's often called the Lake District, a region of volcanic cones mirrored in still glacial lakes that draws comparisons to Switzerland or the Pacific Northwest. And just south of that, the mainland begins to fracture into a maze of islands, channels, and fjords, a coastline so complicated it's genuinely difficult to draw a single clean line for it on a map. Further south still, Chile narrows to less than 10 miles wide in places, a sliver of windswept steppe shared with sheep ranches before it finally reaches Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego, where the wind rarely stops blowing and glaciers spill down from the Andes almost to sea level. One country, nearly 40 degrees of latitude. A person could leave a rainless desert town in the morning and technically be standing near glacial ice within the same nation by nightfall, That is the strange promise and the strange truth of living in Chile. So, how do people actually survive in the driest stretch of that ribbon? Not by hauling water in forever, though for a long time that was exactly what desert communities had to do at enormous cost. The real answer floats in every morning on that same Camanchaca fog. In the 1950s, a Chilean physics student named Carlos Espinosa began experimenting with ways to capture the moisture drifting off the Pacific, eventually building large mesh screens, now known as atrapanieblas, or fog catchers, that let fog condense into water and drain down into collection tanks. Espinosa donated the patent to UNESCO so the technology could spread freely, and it has. Villages like Peña Blanca and Chungungo, once dependent on expensive water deliveries by truck, now run gardens, livestock, and even a small brewery on nothing but captured fog. Researchers estimate that harvesting just a small fraction of the moisture inside the Camanchaca could meet the water needs of entire communities scattered across this desert. And in some of those hillside towns, that estimate is already close to reality. Where fog catchers aren't enough, Chile has gone bigger. Near the coastal town of Caldera, a state-funded desalination plant now pulls seawater in and pushes out roughly 1.5 million liters of fresh water every hour. Engineered specifically to guarantee drinking water for well over 200,000 people across 4 desert communities that have no natural aquifer of their own. It's one of the largest plants of its kind fully financed by the Chilean government, and it exists because, as one international water research organization has noted, Chile is considered among the most water-stressed countries on Earth, a striking label for a nation with glaciers at one end of its map and an ocean running the entire length of it. Daily life in these desert towns has its own rhythm because of all this. San Pedro de Atacama itself is a small oasis town of roughly 10 to 11,000 people, its low adobe buildings clustered around a plaza, its streets often unpaved, sitting at close to 2,400 meters above sea level with the volcano Licancabur looming behind it. Water here is respected in a way that people from wetter countries rarely have to think about. Homes are built low and thick-walled against the desert's temperature swings, designed to trap the day's warmth against nights that can drop close to freezing, even in summer. Farming happens in narrow irrigated oases, a technique the region's original inhabitants perfected long before anyone thought to build a desalination plant. And it's not unusual to see small plots of alfalfa, corn, or fruit trees growing in improbable green strips against an otherwise bare ochre landscape, fed by channels of water diverted from mountain springs and snowmelt streams that have been managed communally for generations. Tourism has also reshaped daily life in this part of the desert more than almost anything else in recent decades. San Pedro de Atacama, once a quiet agricultural outpost, now sees a steady flow of visitors drawn by its lunar valleys, its salt flats, and its night skies, and much of the local economy, hostels, tour agencies, restaurants serving Andean-influenced dishes alongside more familiar backpacker fare, has grown up directly around that. Not far outside town sits the aptly named Valle de la Luna, Moon Valley, a stretch of wind-carved dunes and salt-crusted ridges so barren and strange that early visitors simply borrowed the name of another world to describe it. And at sunset, the whole valley shifts through shades of pink and copper as the light drops behind the surrounding peaks. It's become one of the most photographed stretches of desert on the continent, and for many travelers, it's the single image that first draws them toward this corner of Chile in the first place. All of that attention has created real opportunity, along with the familiar tension of a small desert community, balancing its traditions against an industry that depends on ever more visitors arriving to look at and use water in. a place that was never built to support very many people at all. But step outside the desert, and Chilean daily life takes on a very different, very particular flavor. One built less around scarcity and more around ritual. Most Chileans eat their largest meal at lunch, and in the evening, they gather instead for what's called once, a tradition that traces back to British merchants who settled Chile's port cities in the 1800s and brought their afternoon tea habit with them. Once typically happens somewhere between 5 and 9 in the evening. Bread, avocado spread thin across toasted maracata, jam, the sweet milk caramel called manjar, and endless cups of tea, since Chileans famously drink more of it than almost anyone else in Latin America. It is less a meal than a pause, a daily excuse for a family or a group of friends to sit down together and simply be present. Food carries the country's identity elsewhere too. The empanada, hand-sized, pastry-wrapped, filled with beef, onion, olive, and hard-boiled egg in its classic Chilean form, is treated as close to a national symbol, especially every September 18th and 19th, when the country celebrates Fiestas Patrias, its Independence Festival, with empanadas, grilled meat, and dancing that shuts down entire towns for 2 days straight. Sunday, in particular, has its own unofficial ritual of a fresh, juicy empanada eaten alongside a glass of young red wine. And that wine is not incidental. The valleys just outside Santiago, warmed by that Mediterranean climate mentioned earlier, produce some of South America's most respected vintages. And a short drive from the capital can put you standing among vineyards that have been exporting bottles worldwide for generations. Getting around this ribbon of a country is its own daily reality too, because Chile is so extraordinarily elongated. A domestic flight from the desert north to the lake and forest south can take longer than crossing entire European countries, and long-distance buses, often surprisingly comfortable, remain a genuine way of life for people without the budget to fly. In Santiago itself, daily commuting looks far more ordinary. A metro system, walkable neighborhoods like Providencia and Ñuñoa, and an internet infrastructure that's often cited as among the fastest and most reliable in Latin America, which has quietly made the capital an appealing base for remote workers who need their video calls to simply work. It's worth pausing here for a second, because if a channel like this one is starting to feel like your regular stop for stories about how people actually live around the world, hitting subscribe costs nothing and means you won't miss where we go next. Underneath the food and the rituals sits something harder to name but easy to feel once you've spent time in this desert. An almost stubborn ingenuity, a comfort with making a little go a long way. You see it in the fog catchers strung along hillsides, but you also see it in who came before them. The Atacama people, who call themselves the Likan Antai, inhabitants of the land, in their now extinct Kunza language, have lived in these oases and salt-flat valleys for well over 1,000 years, developing intricate irrigation systems that turned narrow desert streams into working farmland. In their traditional worldview, the great snow-capped peaks surrounding the desert were considered providers, sacred beings that granted water, pasture, and protection, honored through community rituals that still continue in small Atacama villages today, organized around cooperative land structures called elas. Their descendants still weave textiles from alpaca and llama wool, still fire the pottery styles their ancestors perfected, and every February, their carnival fills San Pedro's dusty streets with color and music. Even the small archaeological museum in town, built around the collection of a Belgian priest who spent decades documenting the region's past, holds artifacts that trace this same lineage of adaptation back well over 1,000 years. Proof, if anyone needed it, that people have been quietly figuring out how to thrive here for a very long time, before anyone called it the driest place on Earth. That same desert sky that seemed to offer nothing during the day turns out at night to be one of Chile's greatest natural resources. Because the air here is so dry and so still, with somewhere around 300 cloudless nights a year and almost no light pollution, the Atacama has become one of the best places on the planet to look up. The ALMA Observatory sits on a plateau above 5,000 meters, 66 radio antennas working as a single instrument to study the birth of stars and galaxies. Its images so precise, they've outresolved even the Hubble Space Telescope. On clear nights near San Pedro, guides still lead visitors out into the dark to trace the Southern Cross and the Milky Way's core. Sometimes, blending modern astronomy with the same sky-based traditions the Atacameno once used to track planting seasons and sacred cycles. Nearby, the University of Tokyo operates an observatory at over 5,600 meters, one of the highest optical observatories anywhere on the planet. And together, these facilities have made the Atacama a genuine hub for international science, drawing researchers from dozens of countries to a stretch of desert that, only a century ago, most of the world had barely mapped. It's a small but telling detail about Chile as a whole, a country perpetually finding a way to draw something valuable: water, minerals, meaning, even light from the edge of the universe, out of land that, at first glance, looks like it has nothing left to give. None of this, though, makes Chile an easy place to build a life, and it wouldn't be honest to pretend otherwise. The same mining industry that has made Chile one of South America's wealthiest nations, the world's top copper producer, and among the largest sources of lithium on Earth, most of it pulled from underneath that same Salar de Atacama, also means the country's fortunes rise and fall with global mineral prices, and that extraction carries a real environmental cost. Lithium mining draws heavily on the region's scarce groundwater, a tension that has put mining companies, the Chilean state, and Atacameno communities who still depend on those same aquifers into an uneasy ongoing negotiation over how much water the desert can actually spare. For anyone actually considering the move rather than just watching from afar, the practical hurdles are real too. Chile has no dedicated visa built specifically for remote workers, so most newcomers apply through general temporary residency permits, a process handled by the country's National Migration Service that tends to move more slowly than in some neighboring countries, even if the resulting status is considered stable and can eventually lead to permanent residency. Healthcare runs on a mixed public and private system, and many expats end up paying into a private insurance plan, known locally as an ISAPRE, to access the shorter wait times and English-speaking clinics concentrated mostly in Santiago's wealthier neighborhoods. Money is also a real conversation here, not an abstract one. Chile has the highest income per person in South America and belongs to the OECD, the group of the world's more developed economies. But average wages remain modest by North American or Western European standards. Reporting in 2026 pegged the typical Chilean salary at under $1,000 a month. Santiago, the capital, is the country's most expensive city. A single person renting a small furnished apartment in a decent neighborhood might expect to pay somewhere in the range of $600 to $1,300 a month, depending on the area, with total monthly living costs commonly landing between $1,200 and $2,000 for a comfortable but not lavish life. That's noticeably cheaper than most of North America or Western Europe, but it's also higher than most of Chile's South American neighbors. And landlords in Santiago frequently require a local guarantor for a standard lease, which pushes many newcomers toward furnished mid-term rentals instead. Move outside the capital into smaller cities, and costs can drop by 20 to 30%, though so do job opportunities and services. Then there's the land itself, which never fully stops moving. Chile sits along one of the most seismically active stretches of the planet, part of the Pacific Ring of Fire, and in 1960, it experienced what is still widely recorded as the most powerful earthquake ever measured by modern instruments, centered near the city of Valdivia in the south. Earthquakes remain a fact of life across the country, and building codes, drills, and a certain everyday wariness about the ground beneath your feet are simply part of growing up Chilean. Add to that the sheer scale of the country. A bus or drive from the far north to the far south can eat up multiple days, and you start to understand why regions here can feel almost like separate countries stitched into one long coastline, each with its own concerns, its own accent, its own relationship to the land. And Chile carries the same inequality debates most modern nations do. Despite decades of poverty reduction, the gap between the country's wealthiest and poorest has remained wide enough to help trigger large-scale protests in recent years, disputes over pensions, health care, and the cost of simply getting by that are still shaping Chilean politics today. The country's private pension system, once held up internationally as a model of free market reform, has drawn growing criticism at home for leaving many retirees with payouts too small to comfortably live on, and that frustration has fed directly into the broader argument over how evenly Chile's mineral wealth is actually shared. It's a reminder that even a country this naturally rich, sitting on some of the most valuable copper and lithium deposits on Earth, still has to work out politically and socially, exactly who gets to benefit from what the ground provides. None of this erases what Chile has built. The roads, the internet infrastructure considered among the best in the region, the relative safety of its capital, the sheer resourcefulness on display in every fog net and desalination pipe. But it's part of the honest picture of what it actually means to plant your life here. So, could you actually live in Chile? Really live there? Not just visit? Picture waking up in a low adobe house on the edge of the Atacama, the air so dry it seems to hum, walking outside before sunrise to check a fog net strung between two posts, and finding it beaded with water that fell from nowhere and everywhere at once. Picture 1,000 miles south, sitting down at 7 in the evening with a cup of tea, toasted bread, and a spoonful of manjar, doing absolutely nothing but talking with the people you love, because that pause is simply what the day is for. Picture standing on a salt flat, the color of bone, a volcano rising behind you, and looking up that same night at a sky so clear that scientists built some of the most powerful telescopes on Earth just to make use of it. Picture, further still, boarding a bus in that same desert town and watching, over the course of a long day and night of travel, the landscape outside the window slowly turn from bare volcanic rock to green vineyard hills, to dense southern forest, as though you were crossing 3 or 4 different countries without ever leaving the one passport behind. Picture standing at the edge of a glacier near the far south, breath visible in the cold, knowing that a few thousand kilometers north, someone is checking a fog net for water under a sun so intense it has never once produced rain. Few countries ask you to hold that much contrast in your head at once, and fewer still make it feel somehow coherent, like one long conversation between scarcity and abundance that has been running for centuries and still isn't finished. That is the strange gift of this narrow, improbable country. It takes almost nothing, a wisp of fog, a strip of land barely wider than 100 kilometers, and turns it into an entire varied way of life. Desert to glacier, silence to celebration. It will ask something of you in return. Patience with distance, comfort with the occasional tremor underfoot, and an honest respect for how little water there sometimes is to go around. But for the people who call it home, and increasingly for those who arrive from somewhere else entirely, that trade has always seemed worth making. The fog rolls in every morning here, whether anyone is watching or not, settling on stone, on cactus spine, on mesh nets built by hand, turning almost nothing into just enough. And there is something quietly moving about a place that has learned to live like that. If this kind of story is one you want more of, subscribe and stay a while, because there are more countries like this one still waiting to be understood, one quiet, specific detail at a time.